There's a special kind of loneliness that comes when the people you love most walk away from you. Samuel Garrett knows that feeling better than most. 3 months ago, his wife and 2 sons left him standing alone in the Colorado mountains, saying he'd chosen solitude over family. Now he's back at his grandfather's old cabin, a place that's rotting from the inside out, just like his heart. The roof is full of holes, the walls are crumbling, and most folks would call it beyond saving. But Samuel has made a decision. He's going to rebuild this cabin into something beautiful, something worth coming home to. What he doesn't realize is that hammer and nails can't just fix wood and stone. They might just fix a broken man too. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The truck's engine ticked as it cooled, the only sound besides the wind moving through the pines. Samuel Garrett sat behind the wheel for a long time, hands still gripping the steering wheel, though he'd turned off the ignition 10 minutes ago. Through the dusty windshield, his grandfather's cabin sagged against the mountainside like a tired old man who'd finally decided to sit down and not get back up. Early spring in the Colorado Rockies meant the snow had mostly melted, leaving behind that particular kind of mud that tried to claim your boots with every step. The cabin sat in a small clearing at 8,000 feet, surrounded by ponderosa pine and Douglas fir that had been here long before Thomas Garrett built this place in 1965. Samuel was 52 years old, and he'd spent the best summers of his boyhood right here, learning from his grandfather how to read the forest, how to measure twice and cut once, how to be still enough that the deer would walk right past you. He finally released the steering wheel and climbed out. His knees protested. He'd driven 6 hours straight from the ranger station, where he'd turned in his resignation yesterday. 25 years as a forest ranger, and it had all come down to a brief conversation with his supervisor and a handshake that felt like surrender. The cabin looked worse up close. The front porch sagged in the middle. 2 of the support posts rotted through at their base. The roof, God, the roof was more gap than shingle. He could see daylight through it in at least a dozen places. Windows were intact, at least most of them, but the frames had weathered to gray, and the glass was so filmed with dirt and pollen that you couldn't see through them, even if you tried. Samuel walked the perimeter first, an old habit from his ranger days. Assess before you act. The foundation stones had shifted on the north side, probably from decades of freeze-thaw cycles. The chimney looked solid enough, though birds had nested in it. He could see twigs poking out the top. The whole structure leaned slightly to the east, as if the mountain itself was trying to shrug it off. He'd been 12 the last time he stood here with his grandfather. That was 1985, the summer before Thomas died of a heart attack while splitting firewood behind this very cabin. Samuel's father had never been one for the mountains, said they were lonely, said a man needed civilization. So after Thomas passed, the cabin just sat here. 40 years of weather and neglect had done their work. The front door stuck, swollen in its frame, and Samuel had to put his shoulder into it. When it finally gave way, the smell hit him first. Must and old wood and something else, something that smelled like time itself. Dust motes swirled in the shafts of sunlight that came through the roof holes. Animal droppings littered the floor. Mice, probably raccoons. A bird's nest sat in the corner where the roof had failed completely, but underneath the decay, Samuel could see the bones of what his grandfather had built. Solid log walls, hand-hewn, wide plank flooring, though much of it would need replacing. A river stone fireplace that still stood proud and straight. His grandfather had built this place to last, had built it with the kind of care that came from knowing your work would outlive you. Samuel moved through the front room into what had been the kitchen. The old cast-iron stove was still there, rusted but salvageable. Shelves his grandfather had built still clung to the walls, though most of the brackets had loosened. He ran his hand along the counter, rough-cut pine, worn smooth by years of use, and felt something crack open in his chest. Catherine had loved this place once. He could still see her standing at this counter 26 years ago, newly married, laughing as she tried to work the old pump that brought water up from the well. That was before the boys were born, before life got complicated, before the silences grew longer than the conversations. He'd met Catherine when he was 24, fresh into his ranger job and full of the confidence that came from thinking you understood the world. She'd been a teacher in the small town of Pinewood, 30 miles down the mountain. She'd grown up in Denver, but she said she loved the quiet of mountain life, loved the way the sky looked at this altitude, loved him. They'd married that same year. Jacob came along 2 years later, Michael 3 years after that. Good boys, strong boys. He'd taught them to fish in the creek that ran 100 yards from this cabin, taught them to identify animal tracks, to start a fire without matches, to respect the wilderness that surrounded them. But Catherine had started to change. Or maybe he had. Maybe they both had. The city called to her in ways he'd never understood. She wanted restaurants and theaters and neighbors close enough to talk to without getting in a car. She wanted the boys in better schools, wanted them to have opportunities that a one-room cabin in the mountains couldn't provide. She'd started taking the boys to Denver for weekends, then whole weeks during summer. Said she was visiting her sister. Said the boys needed to see something besides trees. Samuel had let her go. He'd thought he was being understanding, thought he was giving her space. But really, if he was honest and up here alone, with nothing but wind and memory, he had to be honest. He'd been relieved. Relieved not to have to explain why he needed the mountains. Relieved not to feel guilty about preferring silence to conversation. His father had been the same way. Distant, present, but not really there. Samuel had sworn he'd be different, but somehow the pattern had repeated itself anyway. That's what patterns did. They snuck up on you, wore grooves so deep you didn't even realize you were walking in them. 3 months ago, Catherine had asked him to move to Denver. Not asked, told him. Said she'd found a house. Said the boys were there now, both of them, building their own lives in the city. Said he could transfer to an urban ranger position, something with regular hours and weekends off. Said she'd given him 25 years in these mountains, and now it was time to give her what she needed. He'd said no. Not angrily, not even reluctantly. Just no. The mountains were who he was, he'd told her. Take him out of this altitude, and he wouldn't know how to breathe. She'd looked at him for a long time, and then she'd said, "That's what I thought you'd say." She'd packed while he was on patrol. Took the boys, grown men really, but they'd always be boys to him, and drove away. He'd come home to a note on the kitchen table. "We'll be in Denver if you change your mind. But Samuel, we both know you won't." He hadn't. Instead, he'd kept working, kept hiking his routes, kept telling himself they'd come back, that they just needed time, that Catherine would remember what they'd had up here, what the mountains had given them, but they hadn't come back. And after 3 months of coming home to an empty house, a house that had never felt like home, the way this cabin did, Samuel had made a decision. If he was going to be alone, he'd be alone on his own terms. He'd come back here to where it started, back to his grandfather's cabin, back to the only place that had ever made sense to him. He walked into what had been the back bedroom, his grandfather's room. The bed frame was still there, though the mattress had long since rotted away. And there, on a shelf built into the wall, was something that made Samuel's breath catch, his grandfather's journal. He'd forgotten about it, or maybe he'd never known it was here. It was wrapped in oilcloth, protected from the worst of the weather by that one wise decision. Samuel lifted it carefully, unwrapped it with hands that trembled slightly. The leather cover was worn but intact. He opened it to the first page, and there was his grandfather's handwriting, strong and sure, Thomas Garrett. March 1965. A man builds a house not for shelter, but to prove he can stand against time. Samuel sank down onto the floor, his back against the log wall, and began to read. The journal detailed the construction of the cabin day by day, how Thomas had selected each log, had felled them himself, had spent 2 full summers getting the structure sound before he even thought about finishing the interior. There were sketches, measurements, notes about mistakes made and lessons learned, but there were other entries too, personal ones. Thomas had lost his first wife to influenza in 1963. He'd been 45 years old, and the grief had nearly killed him. He'd come to these mountains to escape it, had bought this land with money from selling the house they'd shared, had decided to build something with his hands because his heart was beyond repair. Day 47, one entry read, "Got the first wall up today. Realized I'm not building a cabin. I'm building a reason to get up in the morning. Funny how you don't know what you're doing until you're halfway through doing it." Samuel read until the light faded, until he couldn't make out the words anymore. Then he sat in the darkness, listening to the wind test the loose shingles on the roof, listening to the small sounds of the forest settling in for night. His grandfather had been broken too, had come here running from grief, just like Samuel was running from his own failures. But Thomas had built something, had taken his pain and his loss and his regret, and he'd turned it into walls and a roof and a place that stood for 60 years. Samuel pulled out his phone. He still had a signal up here. Barely, and looked at the last text message from Jacob. It was from 6 weeks ago. "Mom says you're not coming to Denver. Your choice, Dad. Hope the mountains keep you warm." He'd started to reply a dozen times. Had never found the right words. He stood up, joints protesting, and walked back to the truck. He'd brought basic supplies, sleeping bag, camp stove, enough food for a week. He'd also brought his grandfather's old tool chest, the one Thomas had given him that last summer. When Samuel was 12 and still believed that love was simple and families stayed together forever, he set up camp in the least damaged corner of the cabin, rolled out his sleeping bag on the floor. Through the holes in the roof, he could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The same stars his grandfather had seen while building this place. The same stars he'd shown to Jacob and Michael when they were boys, teaching them constellation names that Catherine said they'd never need to know in Denver. Tomorrow, he'd start. He'd assess the damage properly, make a list of materials needed, figure out where to start. The cabin was in rough shape, maybe beyond what one man could fix alone. But his grandfather had done it, and Samuel had time now. He had nothing but time. He lay back, his body already aching from the long drive, and closed his eyes. Somewhere out in the darkness, an owl called. The wind whispered through the pines. And for the first time in 3 months, Samuel Garrett felt something that wasn't quite peace, but wasn't quite despair either. It was possibility. The cabin was broken. His family was gone. His life had come apart at the seams. But in the morning, he'd pick up his grandfather's hammer and he'd start putting something back together. Maybe if he could fix the cabin, he could figure out how to fix himself. And maybe, though he barely let himself think it, maybe if he could fix himself, there might be a way to fix what he'd broken with the people he loved. But that was tomorrow's worry. Tonight, he just needed to sleep and dream of a time when this place was whole, and so was he. Samuel woke to birdsong and the smell of pine. For a moment, still caught between sleep and waking, he thought he was 12 again, camping with his grandfather. Then his back reminded him otherwise. Sleeping on a plank floor at 52 was a different proposition than it had been at 12. He made coffee on the camp stove, instant stuff that tasted like hot brown water, and ate a granola bar while watching the sun climb over the eastern ridge. The light came in sideways through the trees, painting everything gold. This was the hour his grandfather had loved best, that quiet time when the day was still deciding what kind of day it would be. After breakfast, Samuel began the real assessment. He walked the cabin with a notebook, writing down everything that needed attention. The list grew longer with every room he inspected. Roof, complete replacement needed. North wall, 3 logs compromised by rot. Floor, at least 40% of the boards would have to come up. Windows all needed reframing. The list went on for 3 pages. He was pricing out materials in his head, calculating time and labor, when he decided to clear out some of the debris that had accumulated over the years. Might as well start somewhere, even if it was just making space to work. The old furniture his grandfather had built was mostly ruined. A table with 2 legs rotted through. Chairs that collapsed when Samuel tried to move them. A dresser whose drawers had swollen shut with moisture. He carried the unsalvageable pieces outside, stacking them for firewood or disposal. In the bedroom, he pulled open the closet door. It came away in his hands. The hinges rusted through and found a few remnants of his grandfather's life. An old flannel shirt, moth-eaten but still recognizable. A pair of work boots that had hardened into useless shapes. And at the back, under a canvas tarp, a small wooden chest. Samuel dragged it out into the better light of the main room. The chest was locked, but the wood around the hasp was soft with age. He pried it open with a screwdriver from his grandfather's tool chest. Inside were papers, mostly. Documents his grandfather had kept. The deed to the land, building permits from 1965, receipts for materials. Samuel sorted through them, setting aside anything that might be useful. At the bottom of the chest, in an envelope yellowed with age, he found a photograph of his grandfather and grandmother together, young and smiling. He'd never known her. She died long before he was born, but he could see his own features in her face, in the set of her eyes. Beneath the photograph was another envelope. This one was newer, the paper still white. His name was written on it in handwriting he knew as well as his own, Catherine's handwriting. Samuel's hands went still. He stared at the envelope for a long moment, then carefully opened it. Inside was a letter dated 3 months ago, the day she'd left. "Samuel," it began. "No dear, no my love, just his name. I'm writing this because I need you to understand, even though I know you probably won't read it for a long time, if ever. I'm leaving it here because this place means more to you than I ever did. Maybe you'll find it someday, maybe you won't, but I need to write it anyway. I've been lonely for a long time. I know you didn't mean for that to happen. I know you love me in your way. But Samuel, I've been a widow to these mountains for 20 years. I've spent 20 years coming second to silence and solitude. I've spent 20 years trying to build a life with a man who was never really there. Do you remember our 10th anniversary? I made dinner, your favorite pot roast with those potatoes you like. I bought a new dress, put on makeup, even though there was nowhere to go and no one to see us but each other. You came home 3 hours late because you'd found a trail that needed clearing. You ate standing up at the counter, told me it was good, and then went to bed because you had an early patrol the next morning. That was the night I realized I'd married a ghost. The boys, our beautiful boys, they tried so hard to reach you. Jacob wanted to show you every drawing he made, every A on every test. Michael wanted you to teach him guitar, wanted you to come to his school plays, but you were always on patrol, always had something that needed doing in the forest. And slowly they stopped asking. Jacob's college graduation, you said you'd be there. You promised. But there was a fire on the Western Range and you went. I sat in that auditorium with an empty seat beside me, and I watched my son look for you in the crowd. He never said anything, but I saw his face when he realized you weren't coming. Michael's championship game, his senior year, the one they'd worked toward all season. You said you wouldn't miss it, but a hiker got lost and you were the lead on the search. They found him safe 6 hours before the game started, but you were too exhausted to come. Michael stood on that field with the trophy in his hands, looking into the stands for his father, and I had to watch him understand that the mountains would always matter more. I'm not telling you this to hurt you. I'm telling you because you need to know what you chose. Every time you picked patrol over presence, every time you chose silence over conversation, every time you said the mountains needed you more than we did, those were choices, Samuel. And we were the cost. The boys are grown now. They've built lives without you because they had to learn how. Jacob barely speaks your name. Michael pretends you don't exist. I held them together while you held yourself apart. I gave you 25 years. I gave you my youth, my love, my loyalty. I gave you 2 sons who deserved a father. And what I got back was a man who came home to sleep and left at dawn. A man who was present in body, but absent in every way that mattered. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep loving a ghost. I can't keep hoping you'll wake up one day and realize what you have. I can't keep being lonely in my own marriage, so I'm leaving. The boys are coming with me, not because I'm making them, but because they want to. Because Denver feels more like home than anywhere you've ever been. I hope you find what you're looking for up there in those mountains, Samuel. I really do. I hope the silence fills you up the way my love never could. I hope the solitude brings you peace. But you need to understand something. You lost us looking for it. We'll be in Denver. Jacob's number is the same. Michael's too. If you ever decide you want to be part of their lives, really part of them, not just a name they call on obligatory holidays, they'll be there. But Samuel, they're not going to wait forever. Life moves forward even when you're standing still. I loved you. I need you to know that. For a long time, I loved you so much it hurt. But loving you was like loving a mountain, beautiful but cold and completely indifferent to my existence. I hope you find happiness. I hope someday you understand what you gave up. But mostly I hope you learn that some things can't be rebuilt once they're broken. Goodbye, Samuel. Catherine. Samuel read the letter 3 times. Then he set it down carefully on the floor and walked outside. The morning was beautiful. The sky was that particular shade of blue you only got at altitude. The air so clear it felt like you could see forever. The pines swayed gently in the breeze. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals. Samuel walked away from the cabin, away from the clearing, into the trees. He walked until he found a fallen log and sat down heavily. Then for the first time since Catherine left, he let himself feel it. All of it. The grief came in waves. The regret. The understanding that she was right about all of it. He had been a ghost. He had chosen the mountains over his family again and again, telling himself it was duty. It was work. It was who he was. But really, it had been easier. Easier to be alone than to risk the kind of vulnerability that came with real intimacy. Easier to love trees and trails than to love people who could hurt you, who could leave you, who could die on you like his father had died. His father had dropped dead of a heart attack when Samuel was 19. One day he was there, the next he was gone. Samuel had sworn he'd never let anyone hurt him like that again. And so he'd built walls, had kept everyone at arm's length, had convinced himself that independence was strength. But Catherine was right. He hadn't been strong. He'd been a coward. He thought about the moments she'd mentioned in the letter. Moments he'd forgotten or dismissed or justified. Jacob's graduation. Michael's game. 10,000 small moments when his family had needed him and he'd chosen absence. Not because the mountains were more important, but because the mountains were safer. Mountains didn't have expectations. Mountains didn't look at you with disappointment in their eyes. Mountains didn't ask for more than you knew how to give. Samuel sat on that log until the sun was high overhead. He cried, something he hadn't done since his father's funeral. He let himself feel the full weight of what he'd lost, what he'd thrown away, what he'd been too blind or too scared to see until it was gone. When the tears finally stopped, he walked back to the cabin. The letter was still on the floor where he'd left it. He picked it up, folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket over his heart. He stood in the middle of the main room, looking at the holes in the roof, the rotting floor, the walls that leaned and sagged. The cabin was a ruin. Just like his life, he could leave, could drive back down the mountain, could get in his truck and head to Denver, could show up on Catherine's doorstep and beg for forgiveness, promise to change, swear he'd be different, but he'd be lying. Not about wanting to change, he wanted that more than anything, but about being ready to. You couldn't fix something if you didn't understand what was broken. And Samuel was only just beginning to understand how broken he'd been for a very long time. The sky darkened suddenly. Samuel looked up through the roof holes and saw storm clouds rolling in from the west, moving fast. Spring storms in the mountains were unpredictable and often violent. This one looked bad. The first drops of rain came through the roof within minutes, fat and cold. Then the wind picked up, and Samuel heard a sharp crack from above. Part of the roof, a section that had been barely hanging on, tore loose and blew into the clearing. Rain poured in through the new gap. Samuel scrambled to move his supplies away from the worst of the leaks. Water was running across the floor now, finding every weak board, every gap. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls. And Samuel realized with grim clarity that if he didn't do something, the storm was going to finish what 60 years of neglect had started. He grabbed his tools and the tarp from his truck. Working in the wind and rain, he climbed onto the slick, treacherous roof. The whole structure shook with every gust. Samuel wedged himself against the chimney for stability and started pulling off the loose shingles, the ones that would blow away and cause more damage. Better to create a clean gap than let the storm create a ragged one. His hands were numb within minutes. The rain soaked through his jacket, through his shirt, until he was shivering violently. But he kept working. He stretched the tarp over the worst of the damage and nailed it down with hands that could barely feel the hammer. A gust nearly knocked him off the roof. He caught himself on the chimney, his heart hammering. Below, the clearing was obscured by sheets of rain. Thunder rolled across the mountains, and lightning split the sky close enough that he could smell ozone. This was stupid. This was dangerous. He should get down, take shelter in the truck, let the storm do what it would. The cabin wasn't worth dying for, but Samuel didn't get down. He finished securing the tarp, made sure it would hold, and then worked his way around the roof, pulling off loose shingles that could become projectiles in the wind. By the time he climbed down, his whole body was shaking with cold and exhaustion. Inside, he changed into dry clothes and heated water for coffee. The tarp was holding. The worst of the rain was staying out. The storm raged for another 2 hours, but the cabin stood. When the rain finally stopped and the clouds broke apart, Samuel stood in the doorway, looking at the damage. Trees down in the clearing, part of the porch rail torn away, the roof in even worse shape than before, but the cabin was still here. Battered but standing, Samuel pulled Catherine's letter from his pocket. It was damp but readable. He read it again, slowly this time, letting every word sink in. I hope you learn that some things can't be rebuilt once they're broken. He folded the letter and put it back in his pocket. Then he picked up his grandfather's journal and opened it to a random page. Day 73, his grandfather had written. Lost half the roof today to a freak windstorm. Spent the day in the rain trying to save what I could. My hands are raw and I can't stop shaking. But I realized something up there on that roof, fighting the wind. I'm not rebuilding a cabin. I'm rebuilding myself. Every nail I drive, every board I place, it's like putting a piece of my broken heart back together. The cabin might stand or it might fall, but either way, I'll know I tried. I'll know I didn't just sit in the wreckage and give up. Samuel closed the journal. He looked at the cabin. His cabin now, his responsibility, his project. Catherine was right that some things couldn't be rebuilt. His marriage might be one of them. His relationship with his sons might be too far gone. But that didn't mean he should stop trying. He couldn't fix his family. Not today, maybe not ever. But he could fix this cabin. And maybe, in the process of fixing it, he'd fix whatever was broken inside himself. Maybe he'd become the kind of man who knew how to be present, who knew how to love something more than his own solitude. Maybe he'd become the kind of man worth coming back to. It was a long shot. It was probably too late. But standing there in the wreckage of the storm and the wreckage of his life, Samuel made a choice. He'd stay. He'd rebuild. Not because he thought it would bring them back. He wasn't that naive. But because he needed to prove to himself that he could finish something, could commit to something, could build something besides walls around his heart. If he could rebuild this cabin, maybe he could rebuild himself, and if he couldn't, well, at least he'd know he tried. Samuel walked to the truck and started unloading the rest of his supplies. The sun was setting, painting the wet forest in shades of gold and amber. Tomorrow he'd start the real work. He'd tear out the damaged sections, shore up the foundation, begin the slow process of making something whole out of something broken. It would take months, maybe longer, but he had time. He had nothing but time. And for the first time since Catherine left, Samuel Garrett had something resembling a purpose. The demolition began at dawn. Samuel had learned long ago that the mountains were honest about destruction. You couldn't rebuild until you cleared away what was too far gone to save. Sentiment didn't repair rot, and hope didn't straighten warped timber. He started with the floor, pulling up boards that crumbled in his hands like old bread. Some came up easily, their nails rusted to nothing. Others fought him, and he had to use the crowbar, sweating despite the cool morning air. With each board removed, he could see more clearly what his grandfather had built, the underlying structure of floor joists, the careful spacing, the way Thomas had accounted for expansion and contraction. It was good work, solid work, the kind that lasted 60 years, even when nobody was maintaining it. By mid-morning, Samuel had cleared the worst of the damaged flooring. His back ached, and his hands were already developing new calluses over old ones. He straightened, stretching, and decided to explore the shed he'd noticed on his first day. The shed was smaller than the cabin, maybe 10 feet by 12 and in better shape. The roof had held, probably because it was metal instead of shingle. Inside, he found the remnants of his grandfather's workshop. Rusted saws hung on the walls. A workbench sagged, but was still functional. Cans of nails had corroded into solid masses. But there, on a shelf, protected from the worst of the weather, was a wooden toolbox. Samuel lifted it down carefully. The box itself was beautiful, dovetailed corners, a fitted lid, the wood aged to a deep honey color. He opened it and found his grandfather's tools, the good ones, the ones Thomas must have protected even when he knew he wouldn't be using them anymore. There were chisels, their edges still sharp after decades. A hand plane that fit in Samuel's palm like it was meant for him. Several measuring tools, a level, a square, and at the bottom, wrapped in oiled cloth, a hammer. Samuel unwrapped it slowly. The handle was smooth, dark wood, worn by years of use but not damaged. The head was steel, hand-forged, the face perfectly flat despite decades of driving nails. It was heavier than modern hammers, more substantial. He could see where his grandfather's hand had gripped it, where the wood had darkened from decades of sweat and effort. He'd seen this hammer before. Suddenly, the memory came back sharp and clear. He was 12, and his grandfather was teaching him to build a birdhouse. Samuel had been using a cheap hardware store hammer, and he kept bending the nails, getting frustrated. Thomas had stopped him, taken away the cheap hammer, and handed him this one. "Feel that?" his grandfather had said. "That's balance. That's a tool that knows what it's for. You can fight with a bad tool and maybe get the job done. Or you can use a good tool and let it do what it was made to do." Samuel had driven the next nail perfectly straight. "There you go," Thomas had said, his hand on Samuel's shoulder. "You don't force it. You guide it. Let the hammer do the work. You just show it where to go." Standing in the shed, Samuel gripped the hammer and felt his grandfather's presence like a weight on his shoulder. He thought about Catherine's letter, about all the times he'd forced things, all the times he'd tried to make his family fit into his life instead of building his life around them. He carried the hammer back to the cabin and got to work. The rhythm came back quickly: measure, mark, cut, fit. He worked through the afternoon, replacing floor joists that had rotted beyond repair. The work was methodical, almost meditative. Each nail he drove with his grandfather's hammer felt solid, felt right. As the sun started to angle toward evening, Samuel heard an engine laboring up the mountain road. He looked up to see an old pickup truck, even more battered than his own, pulling into the clearing. An elderly man climbed out, moving slowly but steadily. He was thin, probably in his late 70s, with white hair and a face that had spent decades weathering mountain sun and wind. He wore faded jeans and a flannel shirt, work boots that had been resoled more than once. "You're Tom Garrett's grandson," the man said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "Samuel Garrett," the old man nodded. "I'm Doc Wilson." "Well, I was a doctor." "Retired now. I live about 5 miles down the ridge. Saw your truck coming up a few days back. Figured I'd give you time to settle before I came bothering you." "No bother," Samuel said. He wiped his hands on his jeans and shook the offered hand. Doc Wilson's grip was still strong despite his age. Doc looked at the cabin, at the pile of rotten lumber Samuel had pulled out, at the fresh boards waiting to be installed. "Tom was a friend of mine, good man. Knew how to build something that would last. You knew my grandfather?" "Helped him raise these walls back in '65. I was young then, just out of medical school. Thought I was going to practice in Denver. Came up here for a hiking trip and never left." He smiled. Mountains have a way of claiming you if you're not careful. Samuel felt something twist in his chest at those words. Doc seemed to notice. Mind if I sit? Drove up here to bring you some things, but my knees aren't what they used to be. They sat on the porch steps, and Doc pulled a cooler from his truck. Figured you might be living on granola bars and instant coffee. Brought some real food. Bread I baked yesterday, some venison jerky, couple jars of stew. Just heat and eat, that's thank you. You didn't have to do that. I know I didn't have to. But Tom was good to me when I first came up here. Taught me how to survive winters at this altitude, how to read the weather, how to fix things that broke when you couldn't just call someone. I owed him, and I figure I can pay that debt forward to his grandson. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Doc said, So what brings you up here? Besides the obvious. He gestured at the cabin. Samuel considered lying, giving some simple answer. But something about Doc Wilson made him think of his grandfather, and Thomas had never had patience for dishonesty. Running away, Samuel said finally. Or maybe running toward something. I'm not sure which yet, Doc nodded, like that made perfect sense. Tom was running when he came up here. Lost his first wife. Grief nearly killed him. Told me once that these mountains saved his. Life gave him something to do with his hands while his heart healed. I didn't know he'd been married before my grandmother. Most people didn't. He didn't talk about it much. But building this cabin, that was his way through the grief. He put everything he couldn't say into these walls. Doc looked at the cabin thoughtfully. Building's easy, Sam. It's knowing what you're building for that's hard. Samuel thought about Catherine's letter, folded in his pocket. What if you don't know what you're building for? Then you build anyway. And maybe while you're building, you figure it out. Doc Wilson stayed for another hour, helping Samuel measure and cut lumber, his old hands still knowing the work, even if his back wasn't up to the heavy lifting anymore. He told stories about Thomas, about the summers when this cabin was new, and the two of them would sit on this very porch, watching the sun set over the western peaks. Your grandfather used to say that a man doesn't build a house, Doc said, as he was getting ready to leave. A house builds a man. I never understood what he meant until I watched him change over the years. When he started this cabin, he was broken. Barely spoke, barely ate. But board by board, nail by nail, he put himself back together along with these walls. After Doc left, Samuel sat on the porch as the light faded. He looked at the hammer in his hand, at the cabin slowly taking shape again, at the mountains that had been his refuge and his prison. A house builds a man. He opened his grandfather's journal and paged through it until he found what he was looking for. It was an entry from late in the construction, dated October 1965, day 142. Finished the porch today. Sat on it as the sun went down and realized something. I came here to hide from grief. I came here because I couldn't face a world without her in it. I came here to be alone because being alone hurt less than being reminded of what I'd lost. But somewhere along the way, I stopped hiding. I started building. Not just a cabin, though that's here now, solid and real. I started building a new life, one where the grief doesn't rule me, one where I can remember her with joy instead of just pain. I'm not the same man who came here in March. That man was drowning. This man, the one sitting on this porch with calloused hands and an aching back, he's standing on solid ground. Tomorrow I start on the interior walls. But tonight I'm grateful for these mountains, for these trees, for the work that kept me moving forward when all I wanted to do was give up. A man doesn't build a house. A house builds a man. Thank you, Sarah, for teaching me how to use a hammer. Thank you for the 15 years we had. I'm going to be okay now. I'm going to build a life you'd be proud of, even if you're not here to see it. Samuel closed the journal carefully. His grandfather had been running too, running from grief over a lost wife. And the cabin had saved him, not because it gave him shelter, but because it gave him purpose. Samuel looked at his hands, already rougher after just 2 days of work. He thought about the floor he'd repaired, the solid feeling of driving nails straight and true with his grandfather's hammer. He thought about Doc Wilson's words, that building was easy, but knowing what you were building for was hard. He didn't know yet what he was building for. Couldn't see that far ahead. But he knew what he was building from regret, from absence. From all the years he'd failed to show up for the people who mattered. Maybe that was enough to start with. He stood up, stretched his sore back, and went inside. By lantern light, he continued working, replacing the damaged floorboards with new ones, each nail driven carefully, each board fitted tight. The work was slow, but it was steady, and for the first time in months, Samuel felt like he was moving forward instead of just standing still while life moved past him. The hammer felt good in his hand, solid, true, like something he could trust to do what it was made for, if he just showed it where to go. He worked late into the night, and when he finally climbed into his sleeping bag, his body ached with honest fatigue. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. An owl called somewhere in the darkness, and Samuel Garrett slept dreamlessly for the first time since Catherine left. 6 weeks passed in a rhythm of work and weather. Samuel fell into a routine that felt almost monastic in its simplicity. Wake with the sun, make coffee, work until his body demanded rest. Eat whatever simple meal he could manage, then work some more until darkness made it impossible to see what he was doing. The cabin was taking shape. The floor was solid now, every board level and tight. He'd started on the walls, replacing the logs that had rotted, filling gaps that had let in decades of weather. The roof was his next major project, and he'd been stockpiling materials, making the long drive to the lumberyard in Pinewood once a week. His body had changed. The soft middle that had come from 25 years of desk work and truck patrols had burned away. His hands were completely calloused now, the kind of rough that came from constant work with wood and tools. His face had darkened from the sun. When he caught his reflection in the truck's side mirror, he barely recognized himself. He looked like his grandfather, like a man who belonged to these mountains. It was mid-June when Samuel found the photograph. He'd been working on installing shelving in what would be the kitchen, custom-built from pine, the way his grandfather had done it. He was using the journal as a reference, following Thomas's measurements and notes when a piece of paper fell out from between the pages. It was a photograph, faded with age, but still clear. Samuel and Catherine, young and laughing, standing in front of this very cabin. Jacob was on Samuel's shoulders, maybe 6 years old, grinning at the camera. Michael was in Catherine's arms, small enough that she could still easily carry him. Summer of 1998. Samuel remembered that week like it was yesterday and a lifetime ago at the same time. They'd driven up here on a whim. The boys were out of school, and Catherine had suggested a week in the mountains. Samuel had been surprised. She'd started avoiding the cabin by then, always finding reasons to stay in town. But she'd seemed almost excited about it, had packed food and sleeping bags like they were going on a real adventure. That week had been perfect. They'd hiked every day, easy trails because the boys were young, but far enough that they felt like explorers. They'd caught fish in the creek, cooked them over an open fire. At night, they'd lied on blankets in the clearing and looked at stars while Samuel pointed out constellations and made up stories about them. Catherine had laughed more that week than she had in months. Jacob had caught his first fish and insisted they take a photograph with it, even though it was barely big enough to keep. Michael had found a spotted fawn and spent an entire afternoon sitting perfectly still, hoping it would come close enough to touch. And Samuel, he'd been present, really present, not thinking about work, not mentally running patrol routes, not worrying about forest management or fire danger. Just there, with his family in the place he loved most. The photograph must have been taken by a hiker passing through. Samuel could see it in his memory now. The man had been older, friendly, had offered to take a picture when he saw them all together. Catherine had handed him the camera and they'd all posed, happy and whole. What had changed? Samuel sat down heavily on the floor, the photograph in his hand. He tried to remember when the distance had started, when Catherine had stopped suggesting trips to the cabin, when the boys had stopped asking to come, when the easy comfort of that summer had turned into the cold silence that had marked their last few years together. It hadn't been sudden. That was the thing. It had been gradual, so slow he hadn't noticed it happening. Catherine had started working more, picking up summer school sessions, volunteering for committees that met on weekends. The boys had gotten busier, sports, friends, activities that kept them in town, and Samuel had let it happen, had even been relieved, if he was honest, because it meant less pressure to be social, less obligation to be someone he didn't know how to be. He'd thought he was giving them space, respecting their independence, but really he'd been hiding. The same way he was hiding now, up here in the mountains, rebuilding a cabin instead of rebuilding his life. Samuel looked at the young man in the photograph, himself, 26 years ago. That man had been capable of presence, capable of joy, capable of being part of something bigger than his own solitude. Where had that man gone? The answer was uncomfortable but clear. That man had gotten scared. When Samuel's father died, something had broken in him. He'd realized that the people you loved could disappear without warning, could leave you standing alone in a world that suddenly made no sense. And so he'd started protecting himself, started building walls, started choosing mountains over people because mountains were constant and people were fragile. He'd been afraid of losing them, so he'd pushed them away first. So if they left, he could tell himself it was his choice, except it hadn't been his choice. Not really. And they had left anyway. Samuel was still sitting there, photograph in hand, when he heard a vehicle approaching. He looked up to see a different truck this time, newer, with a small trailer attached. A man climbed out, middle-aged, weathered, dressed in work clothes. "You Samuel Garrett?" The man called. "That's right, Russell Pierce. I'm a trader. Buy and sell building materials, tools, that sort of thing. Doc Wilson mentioned you might be interested in some quality lumber." He gestured at the trailer. "Got a load of pine, good stuff, kiln-dried. Giving you a fair price if you want it." Samuel walked over and examined the lumber. It was good quality, straight and clean. He and Russell negotiated price. Samuel was surprised to find himself enjoying the back and forth, the practical assessment of value. They settled on a number that was fair to both of them. As Russell was unloading the lumber, he said, "Haven't seen anyone up here in years. Heard Tom Garrett owned this place." "He a relation?" "My grandfather," Russell nodded. "Never knew him myself, but heard good things." "You planning to stay up here?" "For a while anyway. Tough life, being alone on a mountain." Samuel didn't respond to that. Russell seemed to take the hint and change subjects. "Say, I saw some folks in Pinewood a few months back, asking about property up this way. Woman and 2 young men. They mentioned the name Garrett. Wondered if they were looking for this place." Samuel's hands stilled on the lumber. "When was this? Late April, maybe early May? They were in the diner when I stopped for lunch. Heard them talking to May about whether anyone lived up at the old Garrett cabin. What did May tell them? That it was abandoned far as she knew. That nobody'd been up here in years." Russell shrugged. "Figured you'd want to know, in case they were relatives trying to find you." After Russell left, Samuel sat on the porch steps, trying to process this information. Catherine and the boys had been asking about the cabin. In late April, which would have been about a month after she left, they'd been looking for him, or at least looking for information about him, but May didn't know anyone was here. Samuel had come in May, and he'd been keeping to himself, making the drive to Pinewood only for supplies, and always to the lumberyard, not the diner. So as far as anyone in town knew, the cabin was still abandoned. Catherine thought he wasn't here. Samuel pulled out his phone. He'd been ignoring it mostly, checking it only once or twice a week when he drove down to where he could get a signal. Now he scrolled through his messages, his missed calls. 3 calls from Jacob in late April, 2 voicemails Samuel had deleted without listening to. A text from Michael, also in April. "Mom wants to talk. Call when you get this." Samuel had seen the messages and told himself he wasn't ready. Told himself he needed more time, needed to finish more of the cabin, needed to become someone worth talking to before he reached out. But really, he'd been afraid. Afraid they were calling to tell him it was final, that they'd moved on, that there was no coming back from what he'd done. So he'd hidden, just like he'd always hidden. He looked at the photograph again, that happy family on a perfect summer day. Then he looked at the cabin, half rebuilt, still rough but taking shape. He thought about his grandfather's words, "A man doesn't build a house. A house builds a man, but what kind of man was he building? One who hid from the people he loved? One who let fear keep him silent? One who rebuilt walls and floors but couldn't rebuild relationships? Samuel stood up and walked into the cabin. He found a piece of paper and a pen, sat down at the workbench he'd set up and started to write. "Jacob," he began, then stopped. What could he say? Sorry didn't cover it. Explanation didn't excuse it. Nothing he could write would undo the years of absence, the missed moments, the slow erosion of trust and connection. But Doc Wilson's words came back to him. Build anyway. And maybe while you're building, you figure it out. Samuel tried again. "Jacob, I found a photograph today. You were 6 on my shoulders, grinning like you'd just conquered the world. We were all happy. We were all together. I look at that photograph, and I barely recognize the man I was then. But I want to be him again. Or maybe not him, maybe someone better. Someone who doesn't just show up for a week in summer and call it enough. I'm at Grandpa's cabin. I'm rebuilding it. But really, I'm trying to rebuild myself. I don't know if it's too late. I don't know if you want to hear from me. But I wanted you to know I'm here, and I'm trying, Dad." He read it over 3 times. It felt inadequate, too little, too late. But it was honest, and honesty was more than he'd given them in years. He started a 2nd letter to Michael, then a 3rd to Catherine. But the words wouldn't come for those. He didn't know what to say to Michael, who'd been the youngest, who'd needed him most and gotten him least. And Catherine, every word he thought to write to her felt hollow, felt like an excuse or a justification. So he folded Jacob's letter, put it in an envelope, addressed it. He'd mail it next time he went to town. Or maybe he wouldn't. Maybe he'd finish the cabin first, have something concrete to show them. Proof that he could commit to something, could see something through. The sun was setting, painting the clearing in shades of amber and rose. Samuel put the letter in the journal for safekeeping and returned to work. He had rafters to install, a roof to frame. The physical work was easier than the emotional work, always had been. But as he worked, measuring and cutting and fitting pieces together, he thought about that photograph. Thought about the man he'd been, the man who'd been capable of presence and joy. That man was still in there somewhere, buried under years of fear and isolation. Maybe he could build that man back. Board by board, nail by nail. Maybe he could reconstruct not just the cabin, but the parts of himself he'd let decay. It was dark when he finally stopped working. His hands ached and his back was stiff. He heated up some of the stew Doc Wilson had brought, ate it straight from the pot, and climbed into his sleeping bag. The photograph was on the floor beside him, propped against the wall where he could see it in the lantern light. That family, frozen in time, forever happy in that one perfect moment. Samuel closed his eyes and made himself a promise. He'd finish the cabin, and then he'd reach out, not with excuses or justifications, but with honest acknowledgement of his failures and genuine hope for something different. He didn't know if they'd respond, didn't know if the damage was too deep to repair, but he had to try, had to become the kind of man who tried, who showed up, who didn't hide behind mountains and solitude and the safe distance of silence. Tomorrow he'd work on the roof, and maybe tomorrow he'd also find the courage to mail that letter, one board at a time, one nail at a time, one step at a time toward becoming someone worth knowing. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The cabin stood in the darkness, half-finished, waiting. And inside, Samuel Garrett slept with a photograph of his family beside him, dreaming of a summer day when love was simple and presence was enough. Summer settled over the mountains like a warm blanket. The days grew longer, the air thick with the scent of pine sap and wildflowers. Samuel had been at the cabin for 3 months now, and the transformation was remarkable. The roof was complete, new shingles that would last another 60 years. The walls were solid, properly chinked and sealed. Windows were fitted and glazed. The porch was rebuilt, stronger than before, with railings that would hold against the worst mountain weather. Samuel was working on the interior now, the detailed finish work that transformed a structure into a home. He'd built shelving in the kitchen, cabinets in the bedroom, a mantel over the fireplace. His skills had sharpened with constant practice. His hands knew the tools now, moved with confidence and precision. It was a Tuesday morning in late July when he found the wooden bear. He was clearing out the last of the debris from one of the back closets, pulling out old boxes and forgotten items, when he saw it wedged in a corner. A hand-carved wooden bear about 6 inches tall. The wood darkened with age, but the details still clear. Individual claws, fur texture, the intelligent eyes. Samuel picked it up, and memory hit him like a physical blow. Jacob's 8th birthday. They'd been at the cabin that summer, one of the last summers all 4 of them had spent here together. Samuel had been working on a new shed, and Jacob had been following him around, asking endless questions the way 8-year-olds did. "What kind of wood is that? Why do you measure twice? Can I help? Can I use the hammer?" Samuel had been patient that day, teaching Jacob how to hold a nail, how to drive it straight. And in the evening, after Jacob was asleep, Samuel had stayed up carving this bear from a piece of pine. He'd worked by lamplight, getting the proportions right, adding details he knew Jacob would love. Jacob's face the next morning when Samuel gave it to him. Pure joy. He'd clutched that bear like it was made of gold, had carried it everywhere for weeks, had said it was the best present he'd ever gotten, better than any toy from a store, because Dad had made it with his own hands. "I'm going to keep this forever," Jacob had said, solemn as only an 8-year-old making a vow could be, but here it was, abandoned in a closet, left behind like so many other things. Samuel turned the bear over in his hands. He could see where Jacob had held it, where small fingers had worn the wood smooth in certain spots. Could see a small chip on one ear, probably from when Jacob had dropped it, had cried until Samuel assured him it just gave the bear character. Finding it here felt like an indictment. Jacob had loved this enough to bring it to the cabin, to play with it here. But at some point, he'd left it behind. Maybe he'd outgrown it. Maybe he'd forgotten about it. Or maybe, and this thought hurt more, he'd left it deliberately, discarding a gift from a father who was never really there. Samuel set the bear on the mantel, right in the center. A reminder of what he'd lost, what he'd failed to protect. Doc Wilson had been visiting more frequently, stopping by once or twice a week with food or supplies or just company. He seemed to understand when Samuel needed conversation and when he needed silence. Today was a conversation day, apparently, because Doc settled onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee and waited until Samuel joined him. "Place is looking good," Doc said, surveying the cabin. "Tom would be proud. Still have the interior walls to finish. And the kitchen needs real plumbing, not just the hand pump. Rome wasn't built in a day. And neither was this cabin the first time around." Doc sipped his coffee. "You've been up here 3 months now. How are you feeling?" Samuel considered the question. Different. Stronger, maybe. Or just more tired. Those aren't always separate things. Doc was quiet for a moment. "Tom told me once that he learned more about himself building this cabin than he did in 45 years of living before it. Said the work showed him who he really was. And who was that? Someone who could endure. Someone who could commit. Someone who could build something meant to last." Doc looked at Samuel. "What's the cabin showing you?" Samuel thought about the wooden bear on the mantel, about Catherine's letter folded in his pocket, about the unsent letter to Jacob still sitting in the journal. "That I'm good at building walls, just not always the right kind." Doc nodded like that made sense. "I lost my son to stubbornness," he said quietly. "My own, not his. He wanted me to move to the city when I got older, said I needed to be closer to proper medical care, closer to family. I refused, told him I'd lived in these mountains for 50 years, and I'd die in them too. He got angry, said I was choosing mountains over family. I told him he was choosing convenience over respect." Doc was silent for a long moment. He left angry. "Drove back to Denver in a rainstorm. Car accident on the highway. Gone just like that. And I never got to tell him he was right. That I was being stubborn and proud. That mountains aren't worth a damn if you're alone on them." Samuel didn't know what to say to that. "I tell you this," Doc continued, "because I see Tom's grandson making the same mistake I made, building something beautiful, something that'll last. But building it alone." He looked at Samuel directly. What's it all for, Sam? This cabin, this work. What are you building it for? I don't know yet. Then you better figure it out. Because a house without people in it is just a pile of wood, no matter how well you build it. After Doc left, Samuel walked the property. The clearing was beautiful in the summer light. He'd cleared trails to the creek, had planted a small vegetable garden that was actually producing tomatoes and beans. The cabin stood solid and proud, almost finished now. In another month, maybe less, it would be complete. And then what? He'd live here alone, proud of his work, surrounded by silence and solitude. He'd watch the seasons change through windows he'd installed himself. He'd sit by the fire he'd built, in the room he'd restored, and feel what? Accomplished. Satisfied? Empty, the word came unbidden, but it felt true. He'd rebuild the entire cabin and still be just as alone as when he started. Maybe more alone, because now he understood what he'd lost. Samuel was heading back to the cabin when he heard voices. He looked up to see a young woman stumbling into the clearing, looking exhausted and disoriented. She was in her mid-20s, wearing hiking gear that had seen better days, and carrying a pack that looked too heavy for her frame. "Oh, thank God," she said when she saw him. "I've been lost for hours. My phone died, and I couldn't find the trail markers, and—" She stopped, taking in the cabin, Samuel. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to trespass. I just need directions back to the main trail. You're about 3 miles off course," Samuel said. "Main trail is that way," he pointed, "but it's getting late. You should rest, have some water before you try to make it back." She looked ready to refuse, then nodded gratefully. "That would be amazing, thank you." Her name was Emma. She was a graduate student studying forest ecology, doing field research for her dissertation. She'd been mapping old-growth stands and gotten turned around when the trail markers became unclear. Samuel gave her water, made her a sandwich from his supplies, showed her his map of the area. While she rested, she looked around the cabin with obvious interest. "This place is beautiful," she said. "Did you build it?" "Rebuilt it. My grandfather built it originally. It must be nice having a project like this. Creating something permanent." She looked around at the finished floors, the solid walls, the careful craftsmanship. "Someone's going to be really happy here." "That's the idea," Emma smiled. "So where are they?" "The someone?" Samuel didn't answer immediately. Emma seemed to realize she'd touched something sensitive. "Sorry, not my business." "No, it's a fair question." Samuel looked at the cabin, at the work of his hands. "They're not here. They're in Denver. My wife and 2 sons. "Oh, are they coming up to see it when it's finished?" "I don't know. I haven't asked them." Emma was quiet for a moment. Can I tell you something? From an outsider's perspective?" Samuel nodded. "This place is incredible. The work you've done is amazing. But it feels, I don't know how to say this without being rude, but it feels lonely. Like it's waiting for something that isn't here." She paused. "My dad was like that. After my mom died, he threw himself into projects. Built a workshop, restored an old car, redid the entire house. Kept himself busy all the time. And we kept trying to talk to him, me and my sisters, but he was always working, always had something that needed doing. What happened? He finished everything. And then one day he looked around at all these perfect projects and realized he'd spent 3 years avoiding grief instead of processing it. He'd built all these things, but lost all these years with us." Emma looked at Samuel. "He's trying now, trying to reconnect. But those years are gone. We can't get them back." After Emma left, with clear directions and Samuel's personal trail map, Samuel stood in the clearing as the sun set. He thought about what she'd said, about her father, about building things as a way to avoid feeling things. Was that what he was doing? Avoiding? He went inside and looked at the wooden bear on the mantel. Picked it up, ran his thumb over the smooth wood. Jacob had loved this, had kept it, treasured it until when? When had he stopped carrying it? When had it become just another forgotten thing? Samuel thought he knew. It was probably around the same time Jacob stopped asking Samuel to come to his games. Around the same time Michael stopped showing Samuel his drawings. Around the same time, Catherine stopped inviting Samuel to family dinners. Around the same time, they all realized that Samuel had checked out emotionally, even if he was still physically present. The bear had been abandoned because Samuel had abandoned them first. He set the bear back on the mantel and pulled out the letter he'd written to Jacob. Read it again. It still felt inadequate, but Emma's words echoed in his mind. Those years are gone. We can't get them back, but maybe, just maybe, they could get new years. Different years, better years. Samuel found another piece of paper and started writing again. This time to Michael. Michael, I don't know if you remember, but when you were 8, I carved you a wooden bear. You loved that bear. Carried it everywhere. I found it today in the cabin, and it made me realize something. You didn't abandon that bear. I abandoned you. I abandoned all of you. And I'm sorry. I'm at Grandpa's cabin, trying to rebuild it. But really, I'm trying to rebuild myself into someone worthy of being your father. I don't know if it's too late, but I wanted you to know I'm trying, Dad. 2 letters now. But he still couldn't write to Catherine. Didn't know what to say to her that wouldn't sound like excuses or justifications. He put both letters in the journal and went back to work. He installed a set of shelves in the main room, sanded them smooth, applied finish that brought out the grain. The work was meditative, almost peaceful. But Emma's words kept echoing. It feels like it's waiting for something that isn't here. She was right. The cabin was waiting. And so was Samuel. He worked late into the night, driven by something he couldn't name. By the time he stopped, his hands were cramping, and his vision was blurred from fatigue. But he'd finished the shelving, and it was beautiful, exactly the kind of craftsmanship his grandfather would have been proud of. Samuel cleaned up his tools, put everything away with the care Thomas had taught him. Then he stood in the center of the cabin and looked around. The floor gleamed in the lamplight. The walls were straight and solid. The shelves waited for books or photographs or whatever a person might want to display. The fireplace stood ready for cold nights. Through the windows, his windows, fitted with his own hands, he could see stars. It was a good cabin. Better than good. It was beautiful, but it was empty. And all the craftsmanship in the world couldn't fill the emptiness Samuel felt standing in it. Doc Wilson was right. A house without people was just a pile of wood. Samuel pulled out his phone, even though he knew there was no signal up here. Tomorrow, he'd drive down to town. Tomorrow, he'd mail those letters. Tomorrow, he'd stop hiding behind work and face what he'd been avoiding. Tomorrow, he'd try to build something harder than any cabin. He tried to build a bridge back to his family, but tonight he stood alone in a beautiful room, holding a wooden bear, and let himself feel the full weight of his loneliness. It was the first step toward not being lonely anymore. Early autumn arrived with a whisper of change in the air. The aspens on the higher slopes began to turn gold, and the mornings carried a chill that reminded Samuel that winter wasn't far off. The cabin was 95% complete now. Just final touches remained, small details that would transform it from finished to polished. Samuel had mailed the letters 3 weeks ago. He'd driven to town, stood in the post office for 20 minutes holding those 3 envelopes, then finally handed them over before he could change his mind. Since then, nothing. No calls, no texts, no responses of any kind. He told himself it was fine. He hadn't written the letters expecting responses. He'd written them because they needed to be written, because honesty was the first step toward change, even if change never came. But it hurt, more than he'd expected. The silence felt like an answer in itself. He threw himself into the remaining work. Detailed trim around the windows, final coat of stain on the shelves. A carved wooden sign for above the door that said, Garrett's Rest, 1965-2024. Small touches that would make his grandfather proud. It was a Tuesday morning, unseasonably warm for September, when Samuel decided to tackle the attic. It was the last space he hadn't fully explored. He'd been up there briefly to check the roof from the inside, but he hadn't sorted through what was stored there. The attic was accessed through a hatch in the ceiling of the main bedroom. Samuel pulled down the ladder and climbed up into the dim, dusty space. Light filtered through gaps in the boards, painting stripes across the floor. Boxes were stacked against the walls, covered in decades of dust and mouse droppings. Samuel started sorting methodically. Most of it was junk, old tools too rusted to salvage, moth-eaten blankets, magazines from the 1970s. He filled garbage bags and lowered them down through the hatch. In the far corner, behind a stack of empty crates, he found a larger box. It was sealed with tape that had dried and cracked with age. Samuel pried it open and found children's clothes, small shirts and pants carefully folded. His clothes, he realized, from when he'd spent summers here as a boy. Beneath the clothes was a smaller box. Samuel opened it and found a journal, not his grandfather's, but a child's composition notebook. The cover was decorated with drawings of mountains and trees. Inside, on the first page, was written in careful child handwriting, Michael Garrett's summer journal, age 8. Samuel's hands went still. Michael's journal, he checked the date, the summer of 1998, the same summer as the photograph. He sat down on the dusty attic floor and began to read. Day 1. We got to the cabin today. It's so cool here. Dad showed me and Jacob the creek where he used to fish. We saw a deer. Dad knew what kind it was and everything. He knows everything about the mountains. Day 3. Dad taught me how to skip stones. I got one to skip 4 times. He said that was really good for a beginner. Jacob only got 3 skips. Don't tell him I said that. Day 5. Dad took us on a long hike today. Jacob got tired, but I didn't. Dad carried Jacob on his shoulders the last mile. I held Dad's hand. Mom took a picture of all of us. Dad said this is his favorite place in the whole world. I asked why, and he said because his grandpa built it with his own hands, and now he gets to share it with us. That made me feel special. Samuel's throat tightened. He turned the page. Day 7, we caught fish today. I caught 2, and Jacob caught 3. Dad showed us how to clean them. It was gross but cool. We cooked them for dinner, and they were the best fish I ever ate. Dad said everything tastes better when you catch it yourself. Mom laughed and said that's good because that's all we're eating this week. Day 9. Dad is teaching me to carve wood. He's making something but won't show me yet. Says it's a surprise. I'm making a boat. It's not very good, but Dad says I'm doing great. He showed me how to hold the knife safe. Jacob doesn't want to carve. He's fishing with Mom instead. Day 11. Best day ever. Dad gave me a wooden bear he carved for my birthday. It's amazing. It has claws and eyes and everything. He made it just for me. He said he made it because bears are strong and brave like me. I'm going to keep this forever. I love Dad so much. This is the best summer ever. Samuel had to stop reading. He wiped his eyes and looked around the dusty attic, trying to compose himself. Then he kept reading. Day 13, we leave tomorrow. I don't want to go. I want to stay here forever. Dad said we'll come back next summer. I asked if we could come more than just summer. Dad got quiet. Mom said we'll see. I think that means no. I'm going to miss the mountains. I'm going to miss being with Dad like this. The entries ended there, but there were more pages filled with different summers. Samuel flipped through them. Summer 1999, age 9. We came back. I thought maybe we wouldn't, but Dad said he promised, and he keeps his promises. Brought my bear. Jacob says I'm too old for it, but I don't care. Dad and me built a birdhouse together. He let me do most of the hammering. I only bent 2 nails. Summer 2000, age 10. The cabin is different. Dad seems different. He doesn't talk as much. Mom and Dad had an argument last night. I heard them through the wall. Mom said Dad likes the mountains more than us. Dad said that wasn't true. But then, this morning, he left early to check something and didn't come back until dinner. Mom was quiet all day. Jacob said we probably won't come back next year. I hope he's wrong. Summer 2001, age 11, we almost didn't come. Mom said she was too busy, but Dad convinced her. I don't think she wanted to be convinced. Dad's been different this whole trip. He goes off by himself a lot. Says he's working. Jacob doesn't want to hike anymore. He brought his Game Boy and just plays it on the porch. I tried to get Dad to teach me more carving, but he said maybe later. Later never happened. Still brought my bear, though. It reminds me of when Dad was Dad. Summer 2002, age 12. Last trip to the cabin. I know it's the last one, even though nobody said it. Dad barely talks to any of us. He fixes things on the cabin instead. Mom cries when she thinks we can't hear. Jacob doesn't even pretend to like it here anymore. I went to find my bear to bring home, but I couldn't find it. I think I left it here last summer. Asked Dad to help me look, but he said we didn't have time. We had to leave. I never found it. Maybe it's better that way. It reminds me of someone Dad used to be. Someone who doesn't exist anymore. I don't think we're coming back, and I don't think I even want to. This place makes everyone sad now. The entries ended there. But there were pages after that, written in a more mature hand. Age 13. Haven't been to the cabin in a year. Dad goes alone now. Doesn't invite us. I heard Mom tell Aunt Sarah that she's lost him to the mountains. I don't understand. Why would he choose trees over us? Age 14, Dad missed my school play. He was at the cabin. Mom made excuses, but I know the truth. He just doesn't care. Age 15, Jacob graduated high school. Dad came but left right after the ceremony. Said he had work. I saw Mom's face. She looked like she was breaking. I'm scared they're going to get divorced. Age 16, I don't talk to Dad anymore. Not really. He asks how school is, and I say, fine, and that's it. We don't have anything else to say to each other. Sometimes I look at him and try to remember the Dad from the cabin, the one who taught me to skip stones and carved me a bear. But that person is gone. This person is just a stranger who lives in our house sometimes. Age 18, going to college. Dad offered to help me move. I said no. Mom helped instead. Dad looked hurt, but I don't care. Where was he when I needed help with homework? When I was struggling in math? When I got cut from the baseball team and felt like a failure? Where was he for any of it? He was at the cabin. He was in the mountains. He was anywhere but with me. Age 20. Dad called to say happy birthday. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. Haven't listened to it. Jacob says I should forgive him. But Jacob's older. He got more time with the good version of Dad. I got the ghost version. The version that chose solitude over his youngest son. Age 22. Got engaged. Told Mom first. She cried happy tears. Told Jacob second. He was excited. Thought about telling Dad, but what's the point? He'll just say congratulations and go back to his forest. He'll find a reason not to come to the wedding. He always finds a reason. Age 25. Mom left him. Finally, I'm relieved. She deserves someone who actually shows up. Jacob's torn up about it, but I'm not. Dad made his choice years ago. Mom's just finally accepting it. She asked if I wanted to go with her to Denver. Said yes immediately. There's nothing for me here. The cabin, the mountains, the whole lifestyle Dad chose over us. I don't want any of it. The final entry was dated 3 months ago. Age 25. Spring. Mom found Dad's old letters and photographs. She's been crying. Said she's going to leave the cabin information where he might find it someday. I don't know why. He doesn't deserve closure. He doesn't deserve to understand what he did to us. But Mom says she needs him to know that it's not about what he deserves. It's about what she needs to say. I found this journal while packing. Haven't looked at it in years. Read the early entries and almost couldn't believe I wrote them. I loved him so much. Worshipped him. Thought he was the greatest person in the world. When did that change? When did love turn to anger? I don't even know anymore. Mom's leaving her letter at the cabin. I thought about leaving this journal too. But then I decided no. He doesn't get to read this. He doesn't get to see how much he hurt that little boy who just wanted his dad to pay attention to him. This journal's going in the trash, along with the wooden bear I never found, along with every memory of who I thought he was. I'm done. We're done. And I hope he's happy alone in his mountains. Because that's what he chose. That's what he wanted all along. But Michael hadn't thrown it away. It was here in the attic. He'd brought it to the cabin on that last trip to pack up his things. And he'd left it here, intentionally or not, in the place where all his best and worst memories lived. Samuel sat in the attic for a long time, holding the journal. The morning turned to afternoon. The sun moved across the sky, changing the angle of light through the gaps in the boards. Everything he'd thought he knew was wrong. He'd convinced himself they were better off without him, that they preferred city life, that they'd grown up and grown away naturally. He'd told himself the distance was mutual, that everyone had moved on. But the journal revealed the truth. Michael hadn't moved away. Samuel had pushed him away. Those early entries, full of love and admiration and joy, showed a little boy who wanted nothing more than to be with his father. And the later entries showed that little boy slowly realizing his father didn't want to be with him. Samuel thought about those summers. He remembered them now through Michael's eyes instead of his own. He'd thought he was giving them space, respecting their independence. But he'd been withdrawing, protecting himself from the pain of his own father's death by refusing to fully connect with his sons. His father had died suddenly when Samuel was 19. One day there, the next day gone. No warning, no goodbye. And Samuel had decided, unconsciously but completely, that he'd never let anyone hurt him like that again. So he'd kept his sons at arm's length, taught them skills but not intimacy, spent time with them but always with an emotional distance that kept him safe from loss, safe from pain, and in keeping himself safe, he'd inflicted the very pain he was trying to avoid. He'd made his sons feel unloved, unwanted, unimportant, the wooden bear. Michael had lost it during that last summer, age 12, and asked Samuel to help him find it. And Samuel had said they didn't have time. They had to leave. Samuel stood up and walked to the corner of the attic where he'd found Michael's clothes. He started searching methodically, moving boxes, looking in corners. It took 20 minutes, but he found it, wedged behind a loose board, where it must have fallen and rolled. The wooden bear. Exactly as he'd carved it 16 years ago, Michael had looked for this, had asked for help finding it. And Samuel had been too busy, too distracted, too checked out to help his youngest son find a toy that meant the world to him. Samuel climbed down from the attic, carrying the journal and the bear. He set them on the kitchen counter next to Catherine's recipe box. 3 artifacts, 3 pieces of evidence showing him exactly what he'd done. He'd destroyed his family, not through cruelty or malice, but through absence, through choosing safety over vulnerability, through protecting his heart by refusing to fully give it. Doc Wilson's words came back to him. What are you building it for? Samuel had thought he was building the cabin to prove he could finish something, to show he could commit. But that was a lie. He'd been building it for the same reason his grandfather had, to have something to do with his hands, while he avoided dealing with his heart. His grandfather had been running from grief. Samuel was running from fear, but his grandfather had eventually stopped running, had built the cabin and then built a new life, had married again, had Samuel's father, had created a family full of love and presence. Samuel had just kept running. He pulled out his phone. Still no signal, but he didn't need one for what he wanted to do. He pulled up his photos, scrolled back 3 months to before Catherine left. There were pictures there, recent ones. The boys at a family dinner. Catherine smiling at something off camera. Jacob and Michael together, arms around each other's shoulders. Samuel had been at that dinner, had taken these photos, had been physically present, but in not one single photo was he actually in the frame. He was always the one behind the camera, always the observer, never the participant. Even when he was there, he wasn't really there. Samuel set down the phone and looked at the journal, at the recipe box, at the wooden bear. Then he looked around the cabin, the beautiful, perfectly restored cabin that he'd poured 3 months of his life into. It was empty, just like Doc had said. A pile of wood, no matter how well built, and it would stay empty unless Samuel did something different, unless he stopped building walls and started building bridges, unless he stopped protecting himself and started showing up, really showing up, even if it meant risking the pain he'd spent decades trying to avoid. The letters he'd mailed 3 weeks ago, they were a start, but they weren't enough. Words on paper couldn't rebuild what he'd destroyed. Only consistent, persistent presence could do that. Only showing up again and again, even when it was hard, even when they pushed him away, even when it would be easier to retreat back into the mountains and his comfortable solitude. He had to go to them, not to the cabin. They'd made it clear they didn't want to be here. He had to go to Denver, to their world, to the place they'd built without him. He had to show them he was willing to leave his safe place, his refuge, his protection. Had to prove that he could choose them over the mountains, people over solitude, vulnerability over safety. It might be too late. Probably was too late. 25 years of absence couldn't be fixed with a few weeks of effort. But Doc Wilson had lost his son before he could try. Emma's father had wasted 3 years before he realized what mattered. Samuel's grandfather had spent a year in grief before he started building towards something new. Samuel still had time. Not much, maybe, but some. The cabin was finished, or finished enough. It could wait. It would always be here, solid and patient, whenever he came back. But his family wouldn't wait forever. Life moved forward. Jacob was building his own life. Michael was planning a wedding. Catherine had spent 25 years waiting and was done. If Samuel wanted any chance at being part of their futures, he had to stop building the past and start being present in the now. He packed a bag, not for the cabin, but for Denver. He loaded Michael's journal into his truck, along with the wooden bear and the recipe box. Evidence of what he'd destroyed, yes, but also evidence of what had once been good, what might, with work and time and persistent presence, be good again. As the sun set, Samuel locked up the cabin. He stood in the clearing, looking at what he'd built. It was beautiful. His grandfather would be proud, but buildings weren't legacy. People were. Samuel climbed into his truck and started the engine. Tomorrow he'd be in Denver. Tomorrow he'd knock on doors that might not open. Tomorrow, he'd try to rebuild something much harder than any cabin. He'd try to rebuild trust. Tonight, he drove down from the mountain, leaving behind his refuge, his protection, his carefully constructed solitude, driving toward uncertainty, toward vulnerability, toward the people he'd spent 25 years pushing away, driving toward the only thing that had ever really mattered, his family, and that, he knew, would be much harder. Michael's apartment was in a newer building near the university, modern and anonymous. Samuel sat in the parking lot for 2 hours, working up courage. Finally, as evening approached, he climbed out with the box he'd prepared, Michael's journal, the wooden bear, and a letter. This letter had taken him 3 drafts to write. Not the accounting, not the explanation, but something simpler. An apology, an acknowledgement, and a request. He climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor and found apartment 3C, knocked before he could change his mind. The door opened to reveal a young man Samuel barely recognized. Michael had always been the smaller of the 2 boys, but he'd filled out now, grown into himself. He had Catherine's eyes, Samuel's jaw. And when those eyes saw who was at the door, they went cold. "What are you doing here?" "Michael, how did you find me? I need to talk to you, please." "I don't want to talk to you. I don't want you here." Samuel held out the box. "I found your journal. At the cabin." I read it. Michael's face went white, then red. "You had no right." "You're correct. I had no right. But I did it anyway, and I can't undo that. So I brought it back, along with something else. Something you've been missing for a long time." Michael looked at the box like it might contain a snake. "I don't want anything from you. I understand. But I'm asking you to look anyway. 5 minutes! If after that you want me to leave and never come back, I will. I'll respect that boundary. But please, 5 minutes." Michael stared at him for a long moment. Then he snatched the box and turned away. 5 minutes. "Then you're gone." Samuel waited in the hallway. Through the thin walls he could hear movement, the sound of a box opening. Then silence. Long, heavy silence. 5 minutes passed. 10, 15. The door opened. Michael stood there, the wooden bear in his hands, tears streaming down his face. "You kept it," he said, his voice breaking. "I thought I'd lost it. I thought it was gone forever. I found it yesterday, in the attic where it had fallen. You asked me to help you look for it that last summer, and I said we didn't have time. I remember." Michael looked at the bear, turning it over in his hands. "I was 12. I wanted one more summer with you, one more chance to be your son. And you spent the whole week fixing the damn cabin instead of being with me." "I know. I read about it. About all of it. Every summer, every moment I failed you. Every time you loved me and I was too scared to love you back the way you needed. Scared. You were scared." Michael's voice rose. "I was a child. I needed you. And you were scared?" "My father died when I was 19, suddenly, no warning. and it broke something in me. I decided I'd never let anyone hurt me like that again. So I kept everyone at distance, especially you and Jacob, because if I didn't fully love you, losing you couldn't fully destroy me, but you lost us anyway. You just lost us slowly instead of all at once, I know. And it destroyed me anyway. Just took 25 years instead of happening in a single moment. Samuel's hands shook. I'm sorry, Michael. I'm sorry for every missed game, every ignored achievement, every moment you needed your father and got a ghost instead. I'm sorry for teaching you that you weren't worth showing up for. You were worth it. You always were. I was just too broken to see it. Michael wiped his face roughly. Why now? Why show up now after all this time? Because I finally understand what I did. Because I rebuilt a cabin and realized I'd been doing it for the wrong reasons. Because I want to be part of your life, even if I don't deserve to be. Because you're getting married and I want to be there. Because I'm trying to become the father I should have been 25 years ago. You can't just show up and fix this with an apology. I know. That's why I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking for permission to try, to show up, to be present, to prove over time that I'm different. Michael looked at the bear, at the journal, at Samuel. Jacob called. Told me you were in town, that you built him a bench, that you're trying. I am. And I know it's not enough. But it's something. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can let you back in. Then don't. Not yet. Just don't close the door completely. Let me prove it. Let me show up. Let me earn it. They stood in silence. Then Michael said, I'm getting married in 6 months. At the cabin, actually. Emma, my fiancée, she wants to get married there. Says it's the most beautiful place she's ever seen. Emma, the hiker, the one who got lost. You met her? 3 months ago. She stumbled into the clearing, lost. I gave her directions. Samuel almost smiled. She asked me who I was building the cabin for. I didn't have a good answer then. And now I know. I was building it hoping that somehow, if I built it beautiful enough, you'd all come back. That I could fix the structure, and somehow that would fix everything else. Samuel looked at his son. But buildings don't fix relationships. Presence does. Showing up does. Actually being there again and again, even when it's hard. Michael was quiet for a long time. Then he said, you can come to the wedding. But not as father of the groom. As a guest. In the back. And if you disappear again, if you go back to being a ghost, we're done. Permanently. I understand. And thank you. Don't thank me. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because Emma says everyone deserves a chance to change. And because, his voice caught, because part of me still remembers the dad who carved me a bear and taught me to skip stones and made me feel like the most important person in the world. That dad is still here. He just got lost, for Samuel spent the night in a motel on the outskirts of Denver, unable to sleep. The city sounds, traffic, sirens, voices, felt alien after months in the mountains, where the loudest sounds were wind and wildlife. He lay in the dark, rehearsing what he might say, how he might explain, what he could possibly offer that would matter. By dawn, he'd given up on sleep. He made bad coffee in the room's cheap maker and sat by the window watching the city wake up. Somewhere out there were Catherine, Jacob, and Michael, living lives he barely knew, building futures he wasn't part of. He spent the morning driving past their addresses, information he'd gotten from phone records, from forwarding addresses Catherine had left with the post office. Jacob lived in a small house in a modest neighborhood. Michael had an apartment near the university. Catherine was in a condo downtown, the kind of place she'd always wanted, with neighbors close by and restaurants within walking distance. Samuel didn't stop at any of them, couldn't make himself knock on those doors, not yet. Instead, he drove to a coffee shop and sat with his laptop. He'd brought it on impulse, though he rarely used it. He opened a blank document and started writing. Not a letter this time, but something different. An accounting. An honest, complete acknowledgement of every failure, every missed moment, every time he'd chosen wrong. The words came slowly at first, then faster. Hours passed. The coffee shop filled and emptied and filled again. Samuel barely noticed. He was writing not to justify or explain, but to witness his own failures. to look directly at what he'd done and what he'd failed to do. When he finished, it was 15 pages long. Too long for a letter. But he printed it anyway, paid for the copies, and added them to the items in his truck, the journal, the bear, the recipe box. Then he drove to a hardware store, bought wood tools, supplies. The clerk looked at him oddly, a man buying lumber in the middle of Denver, but didn't ask questions. Samuel drove back to Jacob's house and parked down the street. The house was small, but well-maintained, with a neat yard and flower beds that looked recently tended. Through the window, Samuel could see movement, Jacob's silhouette, then a woman's, his wife. Samuel had never met her. He sat in his truck for an hour, working up courage. Then he got out, gathered his materials, and started building. He worked in Jacob's front yard, right where anyone coming or going would see him. He built a simple bench, the same design his grandfather had taught him decades ago. Nothing fancy, just good solid construction. Pine seat, sturdy legs, fitted joints. Neighbors walking by gave him strange looks, but nobody stopped him. Samuel worked steadily, methodically. This was what he knew how to do, what he was good at. And if words failed him, when words failed him, maybe this would speak for itself. He was fitting the final joint when the front door opened. Jacob stood there staring. He'd changed in 3 months, or maybe Samuel just hadn't been paying attention before. He was thinner, more serious. There was gray starting at his temples. When had that happened? Dad. Samuel stood up, his hands full of sawdust and wood shavings. Hey, son, what are you doing here? Building you a bench. Jacob looked at the bench, at Samuel, at the bench again. In my front yard? Without asking? I didn't think you'd say yes if I asked. A woman appeared behind Jacob, pretty, dark-haired, about Jacob's age. She looked between them with obvious confusion. Jacob, she said softly. Jacob didn't take his eyes off Samuel. Sarah, this is my father. Dad, this is my wife, Sarah. Nice to meet you, Samuel said, feeling the inadequacy of the words. Congratulations on your marriage. I'm sorry I wasn't there. You weren't invited, Jacob said, not unkindly. Just stating fact, I know. I earned that. They stood in uncomfortable silence. Then Jacob said, Why are you here? Samuel set down his tools. I got your letter. 3 months ago. The one you mentioned well, I read about it. The letter you wrote asking me to come to Denver. But by the time I found out about it, you'd already left. Jacob frowned. What letter? I never, then understanding dawned. Michael's journal. You found Michael's journal in the attic, along with other things. The wooden bear, Catherine's recipe box, everything I'd been too blind to see while it was happening. So you read my brother's private journal and decided to show up unannounced 3 months later. I read it and realized I'd destroyed my family while thinking I was protecting myself. I read it and understood that the little boy who loved me turned into a young man who wanted nothing to do with me. And it was entirely my fault. Jacob's jaw tightened. Sarah put a hand on his arm. Maybe we should talk inside, she said gently. Samuel shook his head. I don't want to intrude. I just wanted to. I brought some things. Things I thought you should have. He went to his truck and came back with a wooden box. Inside were the letters he'd written, Michael's journal, the photograph from 1998, and something else. A new carving he'd made in the motel last night when he couldn't sleep. A wooden father and son fishing together. Jacob took the box slowly, looked inside. His face went through several expressions, surprise, pain, something that might have been longing. Is this the fishing trip? From when I was 6. You caught 3 fish that day. Michael caught 2. You were so proud, I remember. Jacob's voice was soft. I thought you'd forgotten. I forgot a lot of things. But not that day, not the good days. Samuel paused. I finished the cabin. It's beautiful. Everything Grandpa Thomas built, restored, better than new. Good for you. The words stung, but Samuel had earned them. It's empty, though. Duck Wilson, you remember Duck? He told me a house without people is just a pile of wood. He was right. Jacob looked at the bench Samuel had built. So you came here to build me furniture? I came here to show you I can finish what I start. That I can commit to something. That I'm trying to be someone worth knowing. Samuel took a breath. I came here to tell you I'm sorry. Not just for missing your graduation, though I'm sorry for that, but for all the times before it. For every game I didn't come to, every moment I was physically present but emotionally absent. For teaching you that mountains mattered more than you did. They did matter more. You proved that over and over. I was wrong. I was scared and broken, and I took it out on people who deserved better. I thought I was protecting myself from losing you by keeping distance. Instead, I just lost you faster. Sarah whispered something to Jacob. He shook his head, but she persisted. Finally, he sighed. Come inside. We're not going to do this in the front yard. The house was warm and lived in, full of small touches that spoke of Sarah's influence. Throw pillows, art on the walls, plants on the windowsill. Everything Samuel's house had never been. They sat in the living room. Sarah brought coffee. Jacob held Michael's journal like it might explode. Does Michael know you have this? No, I didn't know how to reach him. I have his address, but I wanted to talk to you first. Samuel stopped. See if there was any point in talking to him at all. Why did you really come here, Dad? Samuel pulled out the 15-page letter he'd written. I wrote this today. It's an accounting. Every failure, every missed moment, every choice I made wrong. Not excuses, just witnessing. Admitting what I did. Jacob took it but didn't read it. You think that fixes anything? You think showing up with lumber and guilt fixes 25 years? No, I don't think that at all. Samuel looked at his hands, scarred, calloused, capable hands that had built so much but failed at what mattered most. I think it's a start, a first step. I think I have to show up, keep showing up even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. The way you and Michael and Catherine showed up for me again and again until you couldn't anymore. We gave you so many chances. I know. And I wasted them. Every single one. Samuel met Jacob's eyes. I'm not asking for another chance. I'm just asking permission to try to show up. To be present in whatever way you're willing to accept. Even if that's just, I don't know, birthday cards, texts, showing up to things even if you don't want me there. I'll take whatever you're willing to give. Sarah spoke up quietly. Jacob, I think you should tell him. Jacob glanced at her, then back at Samuel. Tell me what? We're having a baby. Due in 4 months. The news hit Samuel like a physical blow. Joy and regret so intertwined he couldn't separate them. A baby. I'm going to be a grandfather. You were going to be a grandfather whether you knew about it or not. Can I? Samuel's voice cracked. Can I be part of her life? Or his life? Why should we let you? Jacob's voice was hard, but there were tears in his eyes. You weren't part of my life. Not really. What makes you think you deserve to be part of my child's life? I don't deserve it. That's the point. I'm not asking because I deserve it. I'm asking because I want to be the grandfather I failed to be as a father. I want to show up. I want to be present. I want to be someone worth knowing. Samuel looked at both of them. I spent 3 months rebuilding a cabin, learning how to commit to something, how to see something through. I'm a different person than I was. Not perfect, still broken in a lot of ways. But trying, really trying. Sarah looked at Jacob. It's your choice. But I think trying matters. And your dad's trying. Jacob was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I need time to think, to process, to talk to Sarah and to Michael. I can't just let you back in because you showed up with a wooden fish and an apology. I understand, but I won't tell you to leave. Not yet. Jacob looked at the bench, visible through the front window. You can finish the bench, and you can text me sometimes if you want. But Dad, if you disappear again, if you go back to the mountains and back to silence, if this is just a momentary thing, I can't do that. I can't let my child experience what I experienced. Better for them not to know you at all than to know you and watch you leave. I understand. And I won't leave. Not that way. I'll be here, however you need me to be here. We'll see, Jacob said. But it wasn't a no. It was a maybe. And maybe was more than Samuel had any right to hope for. He finished the bench while Jacob and Sarah watched from the window. When it was done, he tested its stability, ran his hand over the smooth wood, then gathered his tools. Jacob came out as Samuel was loading his truck. Where are you staying? Motel on the east side. And after this? After you talk to Michael. I don't know. Depends on how it goes. Samuel paused. But I'm not going back to the cabin. Not to live. That part of my life is done. The cabin's finished. It'll be there if we ever want to visit it. But I'm done hiding in the mountains. Jacob nodded slowly. Then hesitantly he held out his hand. Samuel shook it, his son's grip firm and strong. Thank you for hearing me out. Don't thank me yet. This doesn't fix anything. I know. But it's a start. And starts matter. As Samuel drove away, he looked in the rear-view mirror. Jacob was sitting on the bench, Sarah beside him, their hands intertwined. They were talking, probably about him, about whether to trust him, about whether he deserved a place in their lives. He didn't know what they'd decide, but he'd shown up. He'd tried. He'd taken the first step. Now he had to take the second. He had to go see Michael, and that he knew would be much harder. The months between Grace's birth and Michael's wedding passed in a blur of showing up. Samuel made it to every one of Jacob's requests for help. Installing a ceiling fan, building a changing table for Grace's nursery, child-proofing cabinets. He met Emma 3 times to discuss wedding plans, and each time she was warm and welcoming, treating him like family even when Michael held back. Winter came to Denver, milder than the mountain winters Samuel knew, but still cold enough to remind him of where he came from. He thought about the cabin sometimes, wondered if the roof was holding against the snow, if animals had gotten in through gaps he'd missed. But he didn't go back, not yet. That chapter was closed until Michael's wedding in the spring. Samuel spent Christmas alone in his apartment. Jacob and Sarah had gone to Sarah's family, and Michael was with Emma's relatives. Catherine had plans with friends. It stung being excluded, but Samuel understood. Trust wasn't rebuilt in a few months. Traditions weren't rewritten overnight. So he worked his shift at the construction site. Someone had to. And being alone on Christmas wasn't new to him, and told himself that next year might be different. On New Year's Eve, Jacob texted him a photo of Grace in a tiny dress, smiling her first real smile. Happy New Year, Dad. Grace is getting big. Come by next week. Samuel saved the photo and texted back, I'll be there. Happy New Year. February brought warmer days and Michael's increasing involvement in wedding preparations. Samuel drove to the cabin twice with Michael and Emma, helping them envision the ceremony space, taking measurements for the arbor Michael wanted. The cabin stood just as Samuel had left it, solid, weatherproof, waiting. Emma fell in love with it immediately. It's magical, she said, walking through rooms Samuel had spent months perfecting. The energy here is so peaceful, so full of history. Michael was quieter, moving through the space with careful attention. He ran his hand along the mantel, noticed the new shelving, examined the restored floor. You did good work here, Dad. Thank you. It's not about the work, though, is it? It never was. No, it wasn't. They stood in the main room, surrounded by Samuel's craftsmanship, the evidence of months of labor. Michael said, I used to dream about this place when I was little. After we stopped coming, I'd dream we were all here together, happy like we used to be. Michael, let me finish. Michael's voice was firm but not angry. Those dreams hurt because I knew they'd never be real again. That version of our family was gone. You made sure of that. Samuel nodded, accepting the truth, but Michael continued, Emma's right. This place has good energy, good history, and maybe we can make new history here. Different history. Better history. I'd like that. Then help me build the arbor. Help me make this place perfect for the wedding. Not because it'll fix the past, but because it'll start something new. They spent 2 weeks working on the wedding preparations. Samuel and Michael built an arbor together. Cedar posts, a crossbeam designed to hold flowers, strong enough to stand against mountain weather. They set up benches Samuel had built in his apartment workshop. They cleared paths and marked parking areas and made the cabin ready for the 50 guests Michael and Emma had invited. Working side by side with his youngest son, Samuel felt something shift. Michael still had walls up, still kept emotional distance. But there was partnership in the work, a shared goal that created small moments of connection. When Michael asked for a tool, Samuel handed it without needing clarification. When Samuel suggested a modification to the design, Michael considered it. 3 months after the wedding, Samuel found himself back at the cabin on a Saturday morning in late summer. But this time he wasn't alone. Jacob's truck pulled up behind his, and Samuel watched as his son carefully lifted Grace from her car seat. She was bigger now, 8 months old, alert and curious about everything. "She's been excited all morning," Jacob said, bringing her over. "I showed her pictures of the mountains, and she got all wiggly." Samuel took his granddaughter, marveling as he always did at how much she'd grown. "Hey there, Gracie girl. Ready to see where your great-great-grandfather built this place?" Grace grabbed his nose and laughed, a sound that never failed to make Samuel's heart expand. They were expecting others. Sarah was coming up with a picnic lunch. Michael and Emma were driving from Denver, newly returned from their European honeymoon. Even Catherine had agreed to come, her first time back at the cabin in over a decade. "I thought we could install the plaque today," Jacob said, pulling a wrapped package from his truck. "The one we talked about. Samuel had commissioned it months ago, had it made by a craftsman in Pinewood." He unwrapped it carefully while holding Grace in one arm. The plaque was bronze, weathered to look aged, with words engraved in simple, clear letters. "Garrett's Rest, built by Thomas Garrett, 1965, restored by Samuel Garrett, 2024. For Catherine, Jacob, Michael, and all who come after." Below that, newly added, "A place where family gathers, where love is rebuilt, where new beginnings take root." "It's perfect," Jacob said softly. "Where should we put it?" "Foundation stone, right side of the porch. That's where Grandpa Thomas always said the heart of a house lived." They worked together, Samuel holding Grace while Jacob prepared the stone, then trading so Jacob could hold his daughter while Samuel set the plaque in place with mortar. It was simple work, made significant by meaning. Grace watched with wide eyes, occasionally reaching for the tools. "Someday," Samuel told her, "I'll teach you how to use a hammer, how to measure twice and cut once, how to build things that last. And I'll be there," Jacob added, "making sure you actually show up for the lessons." Samuel smiled. Fair enough. By noon, everyone had arrived. Sarah spread blankets in the clearing. Emma and Michael brought wine and stories from their honeymoon. Catherine came with her partner Richard, a kind-faced man who shook Samuel's hand firmly and thanked him for including them. "It's a beautiful place," Richard said, looking around. "Catherine's told me stories about it. I hope some of them were good." Richard smiled. "Some of them. The important ones." They ate lunch in the clearing, simple food, good company, Grace being passed between loving arms. The conversation was easy, punctuated by laughter and the kind of comfortable silences that came when people were actually present with each other. After lunch, Michael stood. "Emma and I have an announcement." Everyone looked up. Emma was beaming. "We're pregnant," Michael said, his voice full of wonder. "Baby's due in March." The clearing erupted in congratulations, hugs, excited questions. Samuel found himself swept up in it, hugging his youngest son, welcoming Emma, feeling joy so pure it almost hurt. "Congratulations," he said, his voice rough. "That's wonderful news. We wanted to tell you here," Michael said. At the cabin, where things started getting better, Catherine was crying, happy tears. "2 grandchildren," she said, hugging Michael. "I can't believe it." 2 and counting, Sarah added with a smile. "We're thinking about number 2 in a year or so." "The Garrett family is expanding," Doc Wilson said. He'd driven up for the occasion, wouldn't have missed it for anything. Tom would be so happy to see this. His cabin full of family again. As the afternoon wore on, Samuel found himself standing at the edge of the clearing with Catherine. They'd barely spoken directly all day, both of them circling around the strangeness of being in the same space again. "Thank you for coming," Samuel said. "I know it's not easy." "No, it's not." Catherine looked at the cabin, at their sons with their partners, at Grace playing in the grass. "But I'm glad I did. This place, it has good memories buried under the bad ones. And the boys deserve to make new ones here." "They do. Richard's nice, by the way. In case you were wondering, he seems like a good man." "I'm happy for you." Catherine looked at him, searching his face. "Are you really?" "Yes, really. You deserve someone who shows up for you. Who appreciates what he has? Samuel paused. I'm sorry I wasn't that person, but I'm glad you found someone who is. I never thought I'd hear you say that. I never thought I'd mean it. But I do. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Catherine said, The boys are doing well. Jacob's a wonderful father. Michael's going to be. They are. Because of you. You raised them right. We raised them. Even if you weren't present, you were their father. They got some good things from you, too. Like what? Persistence. The ability to see a project through. A love of these mountains. Catherine smiled slightly. And apparently the ability to change when it really matters. That's new, but it counts. I'm trying. I know. Everyone can see it. She looked at him directly. I'm not saying we'll ever be friends, Samuel. Too much water under that bridge. But I can be civil, can be in the same space for the boys and the grandchildren, can acknowledge that you're doing the work. That's more than I deserve, probably. But it's what I'm offering, Jacob called out from the porch. Dad, come look at this. The plaque looks perfect. Samuel excused himself and walked over. The whole family gathered around the foundation stone, reading the inscription, a place where family gathers, Emma read aloud. I love that. A place where love is rebuilt, Michael added. He looked at Samuel. That's what this is, isn't it? Rebuilding, it is. And it will be for a long time, maybe forever. That's okay, Jacob said, Grace on his hip. Good things take time. They took another photograph, this one in front of the new plaque, all of them together. Doc Wilson was the photographer again, and he made them take several versions, serious ones, silly ones, ones with Grace reaching for the camera. These will matter someday, Doc said. When Grace and Michael's little one are older, when they ask about how their family came back together, you'll have proof that it happened, that broken things can be mended. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of amber and rose, people started packing up. Sarah and Jacob needed to get Grace home for bedtime. Michael and Emma had a long drive. Catherine and Richard were staying in Pinewood for the night, but wanted to get settled before dark. One by one, they left. Samuel stood on the porch waving goodbye, watching the cars pull away. Doc Wilson was the last to go. You did good, Sam, Doc said, shaking his hand. Tom would be proud. Hell, I'm proud. Thank you, Doc, for everything. For being there when I needed guidance. That's what neighbors do. That's what friends do. Doc patted his shoulder. Don't be a stranger. Come down for dinner sometime. I make a mean pot roast. After Doc left, Samuel walked through the cabin one more time. The spaces he'd restored. The craftsmanship he'd poured months of his life into. But now it was different. No longer a refuge from life, but a gathering place for it. He noticed small signs of the day's visit. A toy Grace had left behind. Emma's sweater draped over a chair. The remnants of lunch still being cleaned up. Evidence of life, of family, of presence. Samuel picked up Grace's toy, a stuffed rabbit, and set it on the mantel next to the wooden bear Michael had returned there after the wedding. 2 generations, 2 tokens of love, side by side. He pulled out his grandfather's journal one more time and turned to the final page where he'd written after Grace's birth. He added a new entry. Today the family came to the cabin. All of them, Catherine, the boys, the grandchildren-to-be. We installed a plaque marking this place as ours, not just mine. As a gathering place, not a hiding place. We laughed together, ate together, made plans for the future. And for the first time since I lost them, I felt like I was part of something bigger than my own isolation. Thomas, you were right about everything. A house doesn't build a man. The choice to love builds a man. The decision to show up, to be present, to keep trying even when you've failed. I've failed so much, but I'm still trying. And somehow, miraculously, they're letting me. Grace grabbed my finger today and held on tight. Michael hugged me and called me Dad. Jacob trusted me with his daughter. Catherine spoke to me without anger. These are small things, maybe, but they're everything. They're proof that even the most broken things can be mended if you're willing to do the work. Thank you for building this place. Thank you for leaving your journal so I could learn from your wisdom. Thank you for showing me that redemption is possible. I'm going to keep showing up. Keep being present. Keep building, not structures but relationships. Not walls but bridges. It's the most important work I'll ever do. And this time, I won't quit until I get it right. Samuel closed the journal and set it on the shelf. Then he walked outside and locked the cabin door. The mountains stood eternal around him, the same mountains that had witnessed his grandfather's grief, his own isolation, and now his family's slow healing. The cabin would stand here, solid and ready, waiting for the next gathering. For Thanksgiving, maybe, or Christmas. For lazy summer weekends, when Grace was old enough to wade in the creek. For when Michael's baby was born and needed mountain air, it would wait, patient and strong, built to last. But Samuel wouldn't be waiting with it. He'd be in Denver, living his life among people instead of apart from them. Showing up for doctor's appointments and birthday parties. Building cribs and changing tables. Teaching Grace to stack blocks and eventually to hammer nails. Being present for the small moments that added up to a life. He climbed into his truck and started the engine. In the rearview mirror, he could see the cabin one last time. His grandfather's legacy. His own redemption project. His family's gathering place. Garrett's Rest, a place where a man had once hidden from grief. Where another man had hidden from fear. And where a family had learned, slowly and imperfectly, that some things broken could be mended. Not fixed. That was impossible. But mended, made whole in a different way. Samuel drove down the mountain as the last light faded from the sky. Tomorrow was Sunday, and Jacob had invited him over for breakfast. Sarah was making pancakes, Grace would be in her high chair making a mess, and Samuel would be there to see it all. After breakfast, he'd head to his workshop, the small space he'd rented in Denver, and finish the rocking cradle he was building for Michael's baby. Steady work, honest work, but more importantly, work with purpose. Work for someone he loved. Monday, he'd be back at the construction site, earning his living. Tuesday evening was dinner with Michael and Emma, discussing nursery plans. Wednesday, he'd volunteered to babysit Grace, so Jacob and Sarah could have a date night. Thursday was his regular check-in call with Catherine, still awkward, still careful, but civil and getting easier. Friday, he'd drive back up to the cabin for basic maintenance, making sure everything was secure for the coming winter. And Saturday he'd rest. Maybe read, maybe work on small projects, maybe just sit in his apartment and feel grateful for a life that had seemed irredeemably broken, but had somehow, impossibly, begun to heal. It wasn't the life he'd planned, wasn't the life he'd had, but it was a good life, an honest life, a life built on presence instead of absence, on showing up instead of hiding, on love that persisted even when it was hard. The lights of Denver appeared in the distance, a constellation of human connection spreading across the valley. Somewhere in that sprawl of light was his family, his past, his present, his future, and Samuel Garrett, who had spent so many years choosing mountains over people, was choosing to drive toward them, choosing them over solitude, over safety, over the comfortable isolation that had nearly destroyed everything worth having. He was choosing to show up, and he'd keep choosing it, every day, for as long as they'd let him, because some paradises are built alone on mountain tops, beautiful and empty, but the best paradises are built together in the messy, complicated, beautiful work of loving and being loved, of showing up, of being present, of finally coming home.